In many ways, Denmark is just like the other Nordic countries, with a generous welfare state and leading statistics in everything from gay rights to gender equality. It has long been the country that liberals all over the world would aspire to replicate. But in one major area, Denmark has differed radically, not just from the rest of Scandinavia, but from the rest of the entire Western Europe. When it comes to immigration, and in particular accepting refugees and low-skilled migrants from outside the EU, Denmark has led the way as an anti-immigration champion, despite remaining progressive in many other areas. And over time, its position has only hardened. While it went from being a target of criticism to a model for formerly immigration-friendly countries like Sweden or Germany. But why is Denmark so markedly different in this area? Why was it ahead of the curve on immigration? What do its policies actually look like? And how did they change the country? This is how progressive Denmark became Europe's anti-immigration champion. But first, I want to tell you about a partner of this video, Delete Me. You might not be aware of it, but there is an entire industry built around collecting your personal information and selling it to third parties. The companies that do that are called data brokers, and they try to get your name, your address, your phone number, your passport information, and whatever else you can imagine. And then they try to sell it to whoever is willing to pay for it. That's a big reason why your inbox is constantly spammed by thousands of companies that are trying to sell you something, or worse, by scammers. And so to protect yourself, you might want to keep your data private, and that's where Delete Me comes in. Delete Me is a privacy data removal company that's been featured in New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, and that's trying to give everyone back control over their digital identity. If you sign up, they will remove your personal information that's being currently sold online from hundreds of data brokers. And they continue to repeat the removal as needed, and you get a personalized regular report of what exactly they removed. Right now, you can get 20% off if you scan this QR code or go to joindeleteme.com/dom. So if you want to take control of your personal data, go ahead and check it out. Thanks Delete Me for sponsoring this. And now, back to the video. In 2019, when Sweden was still proudly declaring itself as a safe haven for immigrants, Denmark was taking a completely different direction. Its prime minister from the Progressive Social Democratic Party declared that her goal was 0 asylum seekers coming to the country, claiming that this step was necessary to protect Denmark's social cohesion. And while that hasn't happened yet, Denmark is getting pretty close to its declared goal. Over the past decade, Denmark has drastically reduced the number of asylum seekers that come into the country. While in 2015, over 21,000 people applied for asylum in Denmark, in 2023, the number has dropped to just over 2,000 people. And since about a third of those are people who have already been living in Denmark, and since many of the applicants will be rejected and subsequently deported, overall, Denmark has only a negligible number of refugees, a few hundred people at most, settling in the country every year, compared for example with Germany, which still has about 25,000 refugees coming in every month. But how did Denmark actually do this? Well, while it might sound simple, in the EU, which still has hundreds of thousands of people crossing its southern maritime borders, and where countries don't enforce border controls between each other, physically preventing migrants from coming into the country is actually extremely difficult. And since physically stopping people is not as easy, Denmark has a different strategy that, when it comes to immigration, could be called becoming the anti-Sweden. This strategy is based on the fact that countries like Sweden or Germany received record numbers of refugees because they were known as welcoming and generous, and therefore a good destination for anyone seeking asylum. And to prevent that, Denmark has decided to brand itself as the exact opposite of that, and it accepted a series of increasingly strict policies in order to do that. First, Denmark makes sure that everyone who might want to come knows that nothing is guaranteed. Denmark has one of the lowest level of asylum acceptance rate in Europe, very strict family reunification policies, and quick deportations of those who are rejected out of the country. But even those who are accepted don't get anything for free, rather the opposite. Refugees are required to work full-time in order to get social benefits, and Denmark's so-called jewelry law allows authorities to seize valuables from refugees to help cover the cost of their stay. And for those who are granted asylums, the government has made it clear that temporary protection is just that, temporary. Even an approved asylum is not a guarantee of a long-term residence, and it can be revoked or not extended at any time. Syrians, for example, have faced deportations despite the ongoing conflict in their home country, as Danish authorities deemed parts of Syria safe enough for their return, even though the EU and the UN have not. And one of the main conditions to stay in the country is a strict requirement for integration into the Danish society. Denmark has mandatory language and culture tests for immigrants, and in some cases, even benefits are withheld until the newcomers can prove that they are integrating into society. It introduced a cap of maximum 30% of non-Western residents that can live in one neighborhood to prevent the creation of ghettos and parallel societies. And basically every year, the country introduces new restrictions and requirements, tightening the immigration policies further and further. For years, Denmark has been exploring partnership with third countries, where refugees would be sent instead of being allowed to settle in Denmark, and the country is now pushing for this policy to be adopted on a Europe-wide level. And it has been openly critical of the more lenient and welcoming policies of neighboring countries like Sweden or Germany, repeatedly enforcing border controls with Sweden to, according to Denmark's justice minister, prevent Swedish child soldiers from entering Denmark. And so the Danish strategy on how to limit the inflow of refugees is not just to make their lives complicated, but also to message loudly and openly that they're not really welcome, and that Denmark is not a good choice as a target destination. But Denmark wasn't actually always like this. For most of the 20th century, Denmark had been open to refugees, with welcoming policies similar to the rest of Scandinavia. So what changed? Well, in the 2000s, Denmark saw the rise of the right-wing populist Danish People's Party, which made immigration its central issue, long before Europe's big immigration crisis in 2015, and at a time when immigration just wasn't really a big topic in Europe. But in Denmark, they were successful, and they became increasingly popular and influential. And even though they never actually formed a government, they forced the mainstream parties to adopt much tougher stances on immigration than they normally would have, forcing the Danish largest party, the Social Democrats, which would be pro-immigration anywhere else in Europe, to adopt policies that would typically be associated with conservative or nationalist parties. Now, this might sound familiar, because this is exactly what many other Western European countries are going through today. All over Europe, far-right parties are gaining steam because they are capitalizing on the widespread public frustration and anxiety about high levels of what seems like uncontrolled and mismanaged immigration. An anxiety that grew because traditional mainstream parties too often ignored the immigration topic and issues around it. But in Denmark, something different has happened. Because mainstream parties, both on the left and the right, adopted strict immigration policies early on, there was less room for extremists on either side of the spectrum to gain traction, and as a result, Denmark managed to maintain its consensual and moderate style of politics that has worked for it for so long. The Danish People's Party has been in a steady decline since 2015, being voted out of the parliament in 2022, and other attempts to launch new far-right parties have been largely unsuccessful, since they just don't have much to campaign on. And at the same time, Denmark has avoided many of the issues that countries like Sweden are dealing with, from a surge of crime to a failure of integration of the immigrants. But despite all that, Denmark doesn't actually reject all immigration. In fact, it does the opposite. Denmark has specifically targeted policies to attract high-skilled workers, and it's actively marketing itself to bring those people to Denmark, while making it harder for low-skilled migrants to settle in the country, sending a clear signal that Denmark is open for business, but not for mass migration. And in many ways, the rest of Europe is now going where Denmark had already went much earlier. Mainstream parties across the continent are adapting increasingly hardline positions on immigration. Sweden, Germany, and other countries are doing everything they can to get rid of their welcoming and refugee-friendly reputation. And Denmark, which was criticized 10 years ago, is now widely and publicly spoken about as the example and inspiration for others. If you like this video, chances are you want to understand what's happening in the world, and if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter, bringing you geopolitical news and analysis from around the globe. It's completely free and you can find the sign up link in the description, so check it out.